It's a hard act to follow. We'll do our best. I'm Chris Joseph, this is Chris Hill. We both used to work at the University of London Library many years ago. And amongst its treasures and things and wonderful objects, it's got the archives of Harry Price, the paranormal investigator, ghost hunter, Borley Rectory, Joanna Southcott's box and everything. When you start working there, they show you around. And the archivist said, of course, my favourite item here is the archives of the talking mongoose. And it struck a chord. I remembered it from the 70s and 80s, reading Osborne books of unexplained and ghost stories. And I thought, oh yeah, I'll pop down at lunchtime and have a look at read all the diaries and extracts and see what that was all about. And the more I looked into it, the more complicated I found the case. It wasn't as simple and as straightforward as I thought it would be. So I'll be giving an overview of the case, and Chris will be reading some extracts from the diaries and the reports that are in the archive. So for anyone that doesn't know about the case, it's basically began in autumn of 1931 when in autumn 1931, a sheep farmer, James Irving, and his family lived in a very remote farmhouse in near a village called Dalby on the Isle of Man. And that's all on its own up on a hill, 2 miles away from the nearest village. And in the autumn of 1931, they began to report that a little animal had appeared in the yard and then in the house. And they said it had the power of speech. And not only did it talk, they said it would sing popular songs. It was quite patriotic. It would sing national anthem, sing hymns, tell jokes. And it would come back with local gossip about farmers and what was going on in the pub. Sometimes it spoke other languages. And it said various things when they asked it, well, you know, what are you? At times it said, I am an earthbound spirit. Or, I am not a spirit. I am just a little extra clever mongoose. So he's a spirit, he's not a spirit, he's a mongoose. On the other hand, I am a ghost in the form of a weasel, and I shall haunt you with weird noises and clanking chains. So, he's a weasel and a mongoose. He also said he'd split the atom. I'll split the atom from the fifth dimension and the eighth wonder of the world. So, there's no self-esteem issues. He also said, if you knew what I know, you'd know a hell of a lot. Well, the Irving family, a bit of background about the Irvings. The parents, James and Margaret, they weren't actually Manx people. Margaret had some Manx ancestry on her mother's side, but they were both actually from Liverpool, and they moved over to the island in 1917. And this is Jim looking quite grand and distinguished now. He claimed that in Liverpool he'd been a successful piano salesman before the First World War, and he said he was earning upwards of, £600 a year then was the equivalent to something like £40,000 a year. And he said they were doing very well, but the business had collapsed during the Great War. He started dabbling in real estate, buying and selling property, bought this derelict farm on the Isle of Man, and then decided that they would move over there. But by the time this whole Mongoose episode started, rather than £600 a year, they were earning £39 a year. He wasn't a successful farmer. That's something like £1,500 a year, £2,000. There is some uncertainty about the truth of Jim Irving's claims, not only with regard to the talking, singing mongoose, but also his general background. There was a rumour I heard on the island that he hadn't been as well off as he made out, and he'd actually been a poor shoe salesman. So I visited the district of Liverpool where he lived, just to see if there was any clues as to his sort of social standing or his economic status. And this is one of the coincidences that many people that write about this stuff or read about this stuff will find these odd things happen. So I was looking into it, and I said to Chris, who's from Liverpool, oh yeah, I've been reading about where Jim Irving came from. It's a place called Wavertree. Have you heard about it? And Chris said, well, I lived there, I grew up there, and he knew all the streets, and it's very familiar to him. So it was one of many odd things. Wavertree is where George Harrison was born. Leonard Rossiter and Norman Rossington from the Army game, Hard Day's Night. When I went there, I got the impression it was quite kind of average, maybe a little bit down at heel. But I believe at the time, around the time the houses were built, at the turn of the last century, they would have been quite well to do. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, it was always a place where working class people could find a way of improving themselves, of being more socially mobile upwards. And it was a kind of the emerging lower middle classes, really. So I kind of had that tenor, the whole area, that tenor about it. So.
Just whiz through a few of the photos of the area. So this is where Jim's parents lived. They worked at station. In fact, both Jim and Margaret's parents worked on the railways. Botanic Place is where they moved, which is near the Botanic Gardens. It would have been quite a nice place to live, I think. So that's the Botanic Gardens. Now, I had a look at the census just to see who was recorded there. And in 1901, they had a domestic servant, Gertrude, aged 16. Although I think many households at the time had servants, but it was an indicator of not wealth, but of that you were in a slightly higher social standing than men who were working class like their parents. But by 1911, this servant no longer appears. Gertrude isn't listed, so there's a question as whether Jim used to say they were doing very well until World War I, but by 1911 it's as if they can't afford a servant, so you start to question whether that was true. He also said he'd been a war censor, censoring prisoners of war letters. He said a lot of things. You can't quite take him at his word. It's just some local pubs in the area. So when Harry Price went to visit, he noticed that Jim Irving did most of the talking, and he seemed to dominate the whole proceedings. He observed that Jim's wife Margaret was she had a presence about her. She had something about her eyes. This is what Harry Price said. The most striking personality in the household, a tallish woman of 59, of dignified bearing, her most compelling feature, two magnetic eyes that haunt the visitor with their almost uncanny power. Mrs. Irving belongs to a type that you would guess at first glance to be psychic. So Jim was 46 and Margaret was 42 when their daughter Vori was born, which was a year after they moved to the island. This is Vori here. Vori is just a Manx version of Mary. And Price said of her, she carries something of her mother's strange look in her greenish brown eyes, which seemed to observe the world with a penetrating yet half-concealed disdain. There was something funny he noticed about the whole family, is that whenever they went outside into the sunlight, they didn't seem to like bright lights. They would kind of recoil a bit from the bright light. It was very dark in the house. They didn't have electric lights. It's just lit by candlelight, really. Vori was said to be intelligent, interested in animals and mechanics. I was told by someone who knew her, who remembered her from when he was very young, that she was thought of as a bit wild, and the nickname that they gave her at the local school was Goatee. Children can be rather cruel, and apparently she smelled of goats because she looked after the animals on the farm. Now, Rory had never travelled outside the Isle of Man. She'd in fact never visited the north of the island, so it's a very isolated existence and lonely for her. And when Harry Price suggested that they go on a car trip, her father very firmly said no, and Price also proposed that she come to London just for a holiday. It wasn't going to happen. The father was very firmly against that. So she led a very lonely existence, and she used to wander the hills, and people would report that they could hear her sort of singing to herself and talking to the dog. The farm itself no longer exists, but if you go up there you can see the traces of it. I'll just whiz through these. There's no actual road, it's quite difficult to find as a path. So that's the remnants. It was pulled down sometime in the early 70s, no one's quite sure why. It's very nice in spring and summer, but in winter it can get quite nasty, and they said that they were cut off for some months at a time when it was snowed in. It can be rather bleak. So that's the old well. Now the well, apparently the construction of it was a bit of a mystery about that, because it's supposed to be, the house was meant to be built around 1840s, 1850s, but the well is apparently of medieval origin, and there's an argument that it's even older, the farmhouse is even older than it's supposed to be. There was, I found someone who'd done a PhD about the history of the area. This is from my book, and it's part of hers as well. Despite Irving's belief that the building was no more than 130 years old, as a keen amateur antiquarian who researched its history, there is some indication that it was far older. Its dry stone construction method and comparatively large size, together with its having been situated on the ancient sand road that ran from Peel to the south, all led genealogist and historian Marielle Hinrichs, so the lady that did the PhD, to posit a medieval origin for Doarlish Cashen and argue for its once having been the home of a person of some importance. It's interesting to note, she argued, in his genealogical survey, the construction of this dwelling was of the very earliest type. The stones were not held together by mortar but by earth. A similar type of construction is to be found in the first two floors of the friary built around 1350. Either Doarlish Cashen, the name of the farm, was built at a very early time, or its builders reverted to ancient practice. There's also evidence that it was on the site of an even older house. There's various old folklorists who wrote about the area, and some of the place names indicate that it was going back to sort of the 9th, 10th century. In the immediate area there's some Bronze Age burial mounds, there's some prehistoric artefacts, very early Christian open-air chapels. So the point about all this is to say that this is a site where people had lived for many, many centuries. And Jeff told the Irvings that he lived there some years before they turned up. In 1917, when Jim was, before they moved from Liverpool, when they were having the house renovated, there were two workmen who were doing it up, and they refused to stay there overnight. They said there was some very odd noises, they were feeling very uneasy, and rather than stay overnight to do the work, which took them a couple of weeks, they preferred to travel from Peel, which was 7 miles away, and go back. There's also a rather strange story from a local folklorist. Now, the book was written in 1929, but he's referring to the 1890s. Some men digging here many years ago, just digging at the farmhouse site, many years ago unearthed a flat stone covering a funerary urn which contained black ashes. They buried it in the hedge bank. A long time afterwards, and not extremely long ago, a young man hunting rabbits with his dog thought he saw a rabbit bolt into the hedge. He began pulling away the stones and soil, and while doing so he felt something invisible pushing him back. When this happened a second time, a sudden fear took him, and he ran down the hillside till he reached his home. A white stone in the hedge still marked the spot where the urn was buried. So this is to suggest that there was something uncanny about the farmhouse in the area long before the Irvings moved there. The Isle of Man is, as many of you will know, is very rich in folklore and legends, particularly this parish, Patrick, where Dalby is situated. It's on the far southwest, and it's one of the last places where people still spoke Manx, and occasionally you'll meet older people who still speak Manx. It was described as the last redoubt of the true Manxmen, where the old beliefs are still prevalent. Now, maybe it occurred to me, maybe Vori in her lonely wanderings around the hills had she disturbed something or roused some long-forgotten entity, or had it been just waiting in the house, waiting for people who were sympathetic, some people that would act as a conduit into this world. So that's what the farmhouse was like. That's where it would have been situated. So it's a small two-storey, two-bedroomed house. It was lit by petrol lamps and candles, no electricity. There was no radio, there was no telephone, and the interior walls had been panelled with wood matchboarding. It was meant to create an extra layer of protection from the wind. And there was a gap, that's sort of just to show the darkness with which they lived and maybe why they reacted badly to sunlight. It's like a seance, isn't it? It's a very staged picture, and they were looking at the father, deferring to him. Now this is Jim demonstrating the gap between the wooden panelling and the actual concrete walls. It's about 4 inches, so it's just about big enough for a little animal to move around all around the house. Jeff's first appearances, as I said, began in autumn 1931. It was a weasel-like animal or a squirrel animal that could talk. And by January 1932, word began to spread, initially within the island, and local newspapers picked up on the story. And then a journalist from the Manchester Daily Dispatch. So this is from one of the local papers, Isle of Man papers. And then, still here? Yeah. This is from the Manchester Daily Dispatch. Man weasel mystery Brooks Island. Queerest beast talks to the Daily Dispatch. It was a tip for the National. Now, I looked into this tip, and unfortunately, Jeff's. All I can say is don't take betting tips from the Talking Weasel, because I checked the results of the National for 1932, and not only did his tip not come first, it wasn't even placed. So just don't do it. And this is the reporter's story. The mysterious man-weasel of Doarlish Cashen has spoken to me today. Investigation of the most remarkable animal story that has ever been given publicly, a story which is finding credence all over the island, leaves me in a state of considerable perplexity. Had I heard a weasel speak? I do not know. Mr. Irving opened the door, seemed a keen, vigorous, young-looking man. I told him I'd come to inquire about the rumour that the house was haunted.
There are no spooks here. Nothing that's happened is supernatural. I'm being worried to death by crowds of people visiting the place. Come in, I'll tell you about it. It was in September of last year that we first heard strange sounds behind the wainscoting of the house. In October, I and my daughter caught the first glimpse of the beast. It was a little animal resembling a stoat, a ferret or a weasel, yellow in colour, with a body about 9 inches long. Its long, bushy tail is speckled with black. It's thin and could get through a very small hole. It appears in the house from time to time, and I made attempts to catch Jack. In about November, we first heard a strange voice coming from behind the woodwork, singing sentences of songs and hymns.
So So I think there's several interesting things there that Jim Irving's saying. The first thing to note is emphatic denial that there's anything supernatural going on. He seems to think it's perfectly acceptable that there's a talking animal. And it's not a talking mongoose at this stage called Jeff, it's a weasel called Jack. But then as we've seen, Jack said he was a ghost in the form of a weasel, so already there's some confusion. So first of all he was Jack, but shortly afterwards, within a few weeks, he said he preferred the name Jeff. He thought that was more distinguished. And he spelt it, he wasn't very good at spelling, you'll have to forgive him. He wrote it down as G-E-F, and then he said he wasn't a weasel, he was actually a mongoose. The strange thing about this is that mongooses weren't entirely unknown to the Isle of Man, and about 20 years before this episode, several mongooses had been introduced to a nearby farm, which was about 8 miles south, and the reason was the farmer there imported them to control the rabbit population, because there's no foxes on the Isle of Man. And a couple of people relatively recently claimed to have seen mongooses in this area. Jenny Randalls, the UFO investigator, said she saw one. And I met another chap who said he'd seen one at night. Let's have some mongooses. There we go. So, the chap I met described it as looking like this, but this is the kind of eyewitness descriptions, was drawn up by an artist, Harry Price Commission, based on descriptions given by the Irving family and also by Jeff, who helped out. So this is not the same thing, and you'll note he's got very large hands, which were very useful because he used to light matches and hold torches and steal things and bang on the walls very loudly with his fist. It was very handy, but you don't really find animals with big human-like hands. I think we need to think of Jeff as something other than a mongoose. Initially, he's described himself as a weasel, so I'd like to suggest there's an idea of him as a shapeshifter, and Jim himself gives a hint of that in some of his diaries. In the photos, which we'll come to later, he appears differently in each one. Jim wrote of seeing Jeff in the form of a polecat at one point. There was also an episode when 3 fishermen had been invited to the farmhouse. A lot of people would go up to see Jeff. It was a big popular event. There was no TV in those days, so people would, on Friday night, Saturday night, go up to Doarlish Cashen, see if Jeff's in. A lot of people were calling in. 3 fishermen were talking to the family, and one of them suddenly stopped and said, "Oh, I thought there was a white cat jumped up on my lap." And the Irvings didn't have a cat, there were no neighbours nearby. And there's another episode that Chris will read about.
Early in 1932, my daughter and I were alone in the house, broad daylight, and I chanced to look through the window of the room we were in. I saw, to my surprise, a very large cat, striped, like a tiger. We ourselves didn't possess a cat, and I called Vori to come to the window to look at it. She did so and remarked on the size of the cat, but more especially the unusually large bulldog head it had. The cat then walked away from the door of the outbuilding, where it was standing, 40 to 50 feet away from us. I then saw it was a Manx tailless cat, and I was then a little more surprised, as the pure Manx cat is usually smaller than the English. I thought, this is no ordinary cat. So I slipped a cartridge into my single-barrel gun and took a go after him. Personally, I'm very fond of a cat, and do not kill for killing's sake. The cat was a little ahead of me, but easily within range, and it turned through an open gateway into a grass field. I was there a few seconds behind and fully expected to see the cat, but no cat could be seen. Look as I liked, the field was level, There was not a bush or any roughness where he could have hidden. And the hedges were all earth, or sod hedges, as they're called here. I detailed my experiences to my wife when I returned that night. When Jeff called out, "It was me who saw you." Further explanation was beyond me.
So the first few months were obviously very distressing for the Irvings. They didn't know what this creature was that had invaded their home. It was disturbing them, seemingly with the objective of forcing them to leave. There were objects being thrown at them that used to spit at them, banging and crashing, keeping them awake. It had this kind of satanic laughter, which we'll hear about later, that it could laugh for 20 minutes at a time, screaming. Jim put poison down in November 1931, and pretty soon these terrible screams were heard, long 10, 20 minutes. But the poison hadn't killed, I say the animal, if it was an animal, didn't seem to make any difference. Vori, the daughter, seemed to be the focus of its attentions, and the parents were so much in fear for her safety that they decided she should sleep with them in the bedroom. So they were dismantling her bed to move it into their bedroom. And as they were doing so, the animal who was behind the wainscoting screamed, stormed, and threatened what he would do to us. This is Jim's account. The voice was absolutely full of malice, hatred, and spleen, and he was striking the wainscot with his fist with the greatest violence. And eventually Vori's bed was transferred to her parents' room, but the animal screamed out, "I'll follow her wherever you move her." So there's definitely a sense of malevolence. There's some more.
Okay, these are taken from Jim's diaries and letters around June 1934, mainly to Captain Dennis. This morning he called us at 7 a.m. and said the time correctly and thumped so violently on the matchboard ceiling that one would think it was a polar bear instead of an animal the size of a rat. The thumping was so violent that our bed was actually vibrating, and the pictures on the wainscoting were moving also. It caused my wife to say, "I wish you would do this when Captain Dennis comes." I must refer to this laughter of Jeff's, which is very varied in character. Sometimes it resembles the tittering laugh of a precocious or mischievous child. At other times, I would say it was the chuckling laugh of an aged person, and another distinct type is one, if I were the author of a shilling thriller, which I would say was satanic laughter, or the laughter of a maniac. We all have a most intense dislike to this last laughter, as it's very trying. He's well aware of his ability to injure. This last summer he asked me, had I any enemies, and should he kill their lambs? I said, you mustn't do anything of the sort, and in any case you couldn't kill a lamb. Jeff at once said, of course I could. You don't know what mischief I could do if I was roused. His physical strength is out of all proportion to his insignificant size, which is very little bigger than an ordinary ferret. We can hear him at night pushing a heavy chair about, weighing 12 pounds.
So after some months, after they tried to poison him and it hadn't worked, the family decided to accept him. So they kind of called a truce, and rather than poison, they began to leave food, biscuits and potato pie, bits of bacon, chocolates and cakes, and this seemed to placate him, and it seemed to do the trick, such that he said, you can let Vori go back to her own room. I won't hurt any of you now. And in return for the food, it would catch rabbits, which it would leave outside the house. And this was actually very useful because, as I said before, they weren't successful farmers, they were quite poor. So the rabbits not only helped to supplement their own food, but they could sell it down at the village. And Jeff also kept the farm outbuildings free from rats, and he used to find lost sheep and duck eggs. So he was proving that he was useful around the farm. If you are kind to me, I will bring you good luck. If you are not kind, I shall kill all your poultry. I can get them wherever you put them. And he also said, as we've already heard, he's kind of threatened what he could do. I am not evil. I could be if I wanted. You don't know what damage or harm I could do if I were aroused. I could kill you all, but I won't. So far we've only really heard the Irving's family version of evidence and very much Jim Irving's evidence, which I've already suggested may not be entirely reliable. So the obvious question is, are there any other witnesses? Now, according to Jim, Jeff used to spend a lot of his time travelling around the island, picking up gossip and information about people and places of which the Irvings claimed to have no prior knowledge. And one of his favourite haunts was the bus depot down at Peel, where he used to eavesdrop on the engineers and bus drivers. And one of the bus drivers is on record as saying, I cannot help myself, I've got to believe when Mr. Irving here can tell me all the contents of my house, even in rooms that cannot be seen from the outside, and there's not been any strangers in my house. And apparently this fellow lived on his own. I found the house where he lived, and it was on the first floor, so it was very hard to see how you could have looked in, unless you'd been invited in. And this chap went on, certain of the employers at Peel disliked to see Mr. Irving coming to the bus depot, as he was able to detect some of their conversations and their actions when they were alone, or rather they thought they were alone. And the famous quote was, that Mongoose knows too much. Now, Harry Price initially sent over one of his investigators to look into this case after receiving these reports and reading the newspaper reports. And this was someone called Captain Dennis, who was an ex-naval man. He was a member of Harry Price's National Laboratory of Psychical Research. He was not a fool, he was a very shrewd man, and he was described as very shrewd, not easily hoodwinked. And Captain Dennis went to Doarlish Cashen on 3 separate occasions. He seemed to have had established some kind of rapport with Jeff for some reason.
Okay, this extract, I think what stands out really is the normality with which Jim Irving relates these episodes with Jeff, which is ostensibly a talking animal. Okay, so it goes, it's from April 1934. Dear Captain Dennis, sorry I've not been able to obtain a snap of Jeff. He'd been missing all week until last night, when he made us aware that he'd returned, and he gave us an account of his wanderings and whom he had seen. The wealth of detail which would rival Sherlock Holmes. I said to him, it's all very well, but what about your photo for Captain Dennis? We've had the camera a week now, and we're no nearer. After a bit of a convo, we had retired to rest, but we all spoke. He said we could have one snap and no more. I asked where he would show himself, and he answered, in the Haggard, which is a kind of stockyard stand. I then asked, where shall Vorry stand, as he will not allow anyone else to snap him? And the beggar at once answered as follows, and the tone of his answer was none too congenial. What the devil do I know? On top of her head, she likes. He promised in a half-hearted manner that if the morning were fine, he would let us snap him. The morning arrived. Today, Saturday, a splendid morning for a snap. We called and called again, no answer. And now, Saturday afternoon, and no sign. After a lot of talk from his last night, he coughed, scraped, and cleared his throat exactly as a human, and a male at that. Subsequently, he asked if there were any biscuits, and my wife said there were 2 for him, up on the top, his sanctum. He then asked what sort. My wife said, afternoon tea biscuits. He said, "You can keep them, I don't like them." And he left them untouched. Jeff's well aware of your coming. At this very moment, he's talking to my wife. He's very capricious and may not speak to you on your first call up to my place, but feels sure he ultimately will. Whether you will succeed in obtaining the answers you want remains to be seen. At one time, I never thought he would sit for a snap at himself. And if we were not persistent, he would simply go on living his life and having all his own way in everything. By consenting to answer his questions, we appear to have strengthened our influence over him. So as soon as the snaps are developed, if a success, I will forward on to you.
So Captain Dennis visited the farmhouse 3 times, 3 separate occasions. And on his first visit, he saw a large packing needle being thrown at the teapot. It came from somewhere behind the wooden matchboarding. He could also hear plates being moved in the scullery, which he checked and there was no one there. Another time he visited, it was October, so we got there about 5:30. It was getting a bit dark. He was waiting for some hours for Jeff to make his appearance. Nothing was happening. And by 11 o'clock, Mrs. Irving said to the daughter, "It's time for you to go to bed." Captain Dennis and Jim Irving both made sure that Rory was in her bedroom. And half an hour later, there was a few knocks began to be heard. And Dennis shouted, "Come on, Jeff, if you won't talk, make a noise." And I'll read what he says. In response, raps of various qualities of sound started from different points of the house with great rapidity. I then heard a bedroom door banged with extraordinary violence, so suggested we go upstairs to see what had happened. At that minute, a shrill, very excited and highly pitched voice screamed out, "Come on, look!" So up we went and did look, and we found the fastener on the outside of Rory's door was turned down, so she could not get out of the room. This is one of the other peculiarities about the story, that the daughter's bedroom had a little latch on the outside to sort of keep her in. It's been suggested she was a sleepwalker. That's never really been explained, but there's some odd things in that house. So they checked, and this little latch was down, so they were fairly sure she could not get out of the room. Checked, she was in bed, and she said that Jeff was overhead between the slate roof and the ceiling. And then the obvious question that Dennis asked himself was, had all this noise, all this banging and screaming, been Rory, the daughter's doing? So he asked, well, let me into her bedroom, put her out, lock the door, see if I can get out. And he couldn't get out, so he found it impossible to exit. He went outside again. The voice then started in earnest, and the noise in the house was amazing. Shrill screams accompanied by terrific knocking, loud bangs emanated from all parts of the house in quick succession, as if the perpetrator moved with lightning speed. The noise continued for about 15 minutes, culminating with tremendous bangs, as if something had been thrown with great violence. And on another of his visits, he turned up. He could hear Jeff's voice, and the voice was coming from behind the wooden panelling in the front room. Now, at the time, Mr. and Mrs. Irving were in full view, so he could see them quite clearly. And Vori was outside. She was feeding the chickens. She was 100 feet away, so it wasn't her, and yet he could see the two parents. He was very sure it wasn't them. Another time he was outside, 80 paces away, he said, with Jim Irving, and he knew the daughter was indoors, but he could hear Jeff's voice just calling to them, just over his left shoulder, quite close. "That's Jeff," said Dennis, "and he is quite close to us." Now this chap here should be Manuel Fodor, who was a psychoanalyst and a lawyer, originally from Hungary, and he was a writer. He'd studied under Sigmund Freud. He was no fool. This is quite an educated, intellectual man. He specialised in poltergeist, mediums and ghosts. And he was a research officer for the Society for Psychical Research. he took a great interest in this case, and he actually went to stay with the family for a week. I think his investigation was a lot more rigorous than Harry Price's. And while he was there, he went around interviewing as many people as possible who have claimed to know the Irvings or have heard Jeff. And he interviewed several people who claimed they'd heard Jeff. There was a couple of lads. There's a 19-year-old Harry Hall who described Jeff's voice as a very high, screechy sort. And his cousin Will Cubban, 15-year-old, said, "Jeff asked me, 'Can you drive a steamroller?' I said, 'Yes.' He did not believe. 'You young bugger, you drive it into the hedge.'" And another chap he interviewed was a postman who said he heard Jeff's very high-pitched voice. He was standing in the kitchen with Jim and the daughter. The first words, the postman said, were very hard to understand, but once I got used to it, I could follow every word. "I would say the voice is a full octave higher than the human voice. There is no doubt in my mind that I heard Jeff. He did not use very nice language. 'Put the bloody gramophone on,' is a fair example of his choice bits." Now, among Jim Irving's very, very voluminous and extensive diaries, very repetitive diaries and letters, there's numerous other examples of uncanny events being witnessed by local people. A couple of examples. He has on several occasions been seen. The best description was given by a schoolboy living 2 miles away. He said, "I saw Jeff in the field behind the chapel. He was little and he had a flat face, yellow tail, and a big bushy tail behind him." There was a couple of road repair workers who were working on repairing the road half a mile down from the farmhouse. One of these guys was having his lunch and he threw a bit of mouldy bread from his sandwich into the field, and then he was amazed to see this piece of bread moving of its own accord. He swore that's what he saw. As a cousin of Jim Irving, Cyril, was tilling a field near the farmhouse, and a stone was thrown over a hedge at him. And when he looked, there was no one in the field. And when you go up there, there's not a lot of cover, there's not a lot of trees or anything where people can hide behind. These accounts are of less value because here we only have Jim's word for it, unlike the times when Fodor was interviewing people. But in my opinion, there's something about his sheer insistence, page after page of this stuff, year upon year, all about these very everyday kind of humdrum events. It's got mundane detail, which I think gives it some authenticity. I think if you were going to make something up, you would maybe be predicting the next World War or death of the king or something very dramatic, but it was all quite banal and everyday, which Chris has got some more examples of.
Yeah, these examples are far from epiphanic or apocalyptic in any way, and they're particularly comical, I find. They're from April, May 32. I was awakened at 5 a.m. by the animal calling, Jim, I'm sick. And at once, I heard him vomiting like a cat. He asked me to tell Borry to go downstairs and put a source of water on the mantelshelf, as he wanted a drink. He then said he'd also been sick under my bed, and this proved to be so. Part of the food vomited was carrots. He's only just told me that he entered a cottage at Balaheg and ate the food there. Brought home a paintbrush, said he found it hidden in a rabbit hole on the mountain road. That evening, he threw many small articles into our bedroom whilst we were both there. Touched my hand on the beans in the morning. Today, he brought home a pair of iron pincers from a farm 1.5 miles away. Said he found them on the wall. I was in Peel on Tuesday last to post a letter and diary to you, and had occasion to pass the bus depot and saw Gail, who asked me, "Anything new about Jeff?" I answered, "Yes. What progress is your wife making with that brown and yellow jumper she's knitting?" Poor Gail. He didn't know whether he was on his head or his heels as he answered, My wife is knitting such a jumper in those two colours. Well, how the deuce can you know that? She only started it a few days ago. May I say that we have not the least knowledge of Mrs. Gale. Okay, completely kind of uninteresting details really, but as Chris says, you know, they kind of reinforce a sense of reality, a sense of presence that you wouldn't kind of make up.
Now, as for any physical evidence, there were some hair samples that Jeff allegedly left. Harry Price received them, they were posted down to London, he had them analysed, sent them to a specialist at the Natural History Museum who just was fairly convinced they belonged to a dog, and indeed the family did have a sheepdog called Mona. There are also some paw prints that Jeff made in some clay, which are fairly unconvincing. Again, this Natural History Museum guy said there's no such animal that has such a difference in size between its front paws and its back. I won't go into great detail, you can find these on the internet, although in my book. The photographs, I think, are arguably stronger evidence. You may disagree. First, to now bear in mind that Vori had never used a camera before, so she was still getting used to focusing and just how to use the camera. These first two are from the Harry Price Archive, University of London. They're fairly inconclusive. I think if you look at the other one, you'll see, I think that's supposed to be Jeff, could be a standing stone, could be a lump of wood. Believe it or not, there's a set of 4, and those are the best 2, so I've spared you the other 2. Jeff is too far away, let's say that. This one is possibly more convincing. So what we're supposed to be seeing is, that's his tail, that's his back, and that's his head. And don't be fooled by all this kind of jagged head. When you see the original, which you can if you go to the library, it's just blades of grass in front of his head. So that's supposed to be Jeff in profile. There's a couple of others from the Society of Psychical Research's archives. There's this kind of stripe, like a skunk, down his back. I think his tail's curled up like a squirrel over his head. There's another one in that series. That's a close-up. It's a cuddly toy, really, isn't it? And there you can see the stripes there on his back there. It has been suggested that these are fox furs that were cleverly arranged, and ladies at the time would wear fox furs. Probably too expensive for the Irvings, bearing in mind their poverty. Fodor, when he was living there for a week, he went through all the drawers in the house. He was looking for a fox stole that Mrs. Irving might have owned, couldn't find any. It did occur to me that maybe Vori, who hunted the rabbits with the dog, could have skinned a rabbit and arranged it on there. But the main thing I think about these is that he appears different in each photo. Another rather peculiar episode was when Rollo Ahmed, the occultist, the yoga practitioner, lecturer, convicted fraudster, friend of Dennis Wheatley and Alistair Crowley, he thought, oh, I can sort this out. He went to the Isle of Man to investigate the case. And he went with his wife Theodora, who was a spiritualist medium. And as soon as they entered the house, Theodora said she could feel there's an atmosphere in this house. There's something here. And she likened it to the feeling she would get during a seance when she would go under control and a spirit would speak through her. So she said there was definitely something there. Rollo sat down cross-legged in a yoga position on the floor and lit some incense and tried to conjure Jeff up. Well, that didn't work. And after he went back, Jeff said, I didn't like that man. I don't like that Hindu magic. So that wasn't a success. An oddity about this visit is these paintings, watercolours, oils hanging on the wall. There's a Maori prince or chieftain, and Theodora Rola's wife. She said that it resembled Jeff, which I think is a very odd thing to say. And she could see something significant in these paintings. And Irving as well wrote to a friend of his. He seemed to have been convinced. He said, I can see a man's face, forehead, eyes, nose, lips, chin, and a peculiar headdress. And also, sometimes he said he looks like a dog, other times he looks like anything at all. He didn't want to have his photo taken, it was against his wish. It appears to me that Captain Dennis's views that Jeff can alter his form is not far out. So again, we come back to this idea of shape-shifting. So having seen some of the evidence such as it is, what can we conclude? Firstly, one has to consider the possibility of fraud. The hair samples were taken from the dog. The paw prints weren't very convincing at all. I spoke to several local people there whose parents or uncles remembered the case, and it was generally believed in the area that the whole thing was a hoax done by the mother and the daughter. And the idea that poor old Jim had been taken for a ride by his wife and daughter who wanted to leave and go back to Liverpool, and they were trying to frighten him. Well, the first thing to say about that is if that was their attempt, it was very unsuccessful, because they only left in 1945 when Jim Irving died. It is an attractive explanation, the idea that it was a hoax or a prank that got out of hand, but I think it's not entirely satisfactory, because if the whole thing had been a hoax, then Jim Irving must have been involved with it as well, because this went on for several years, and various times in his diaries and letters he makes the claim that Jeff spoke to him whilst he was alone, or sometimes he'll talk about seeing Jeff or touching him. For example, Thursday, May 12th, 1932, took hold of my fingers with his hands several times. Ma'am, that was Mrs. Irving, Ma'am had her fingers in his mouth and could feel his teeth. So what was Jim Irving seeing and touching if his wife and daughter were perpetrating a hoax against him? And Fodor made the observation, having stayed there for a week and seeing how small the house was, 2 up, 2 down, he said it would be very hard to maintain this charade over years without being detected. Harry Price thought it was a hoax, but not for financial gain, and despite their extreme poverty, Jim Irving refused. A national newspaper had offered to purchase some of those photos for 3 guineas, which was quite a lot of money, and he refused. There was also a US film producer offered $50,000, a huge amount of money. He said he wanted exclusive rights to Jeff. He was kind of like Barnum Bailey figure. He was going to take Jeff Brown's tour around the States in circus. Again, Jim said no. He didn't want to leave. Want the animal to be sort of taken away from him. He was part of the family. Harry Price, as I said, thought it was a hoax, but he thought there was a psychological motive. And this is an unpublished letter that he wrote to a correspondent of his. I agree that the whole family must be mixed up in it, but there still remains the question of motive. It certainly is not to draw people to the farmhouse, because they do their utmost to keep them away. The motive lies much deeper than mere publicity, and both Price and Fodor argued for a psychological or a psychiatric explanation that the loneliness of the Irvings, particularly Vori the daughter, had led to a collective delusion. So Irving's grandiosity and the sense that he was destined for something better, that he had been this successful piano dealer in Liverpool, moving amongst high society, and he'd been reduced to the status of a failed farmer. That he kind of latched onto this as a means of getting attention and somehow respect. But if it was just a collective delusion amongst the three of them, how does one explain the incidents witnessed by Captain Dennis, for example, or the people at the bus depot, or the road repair workers? I think it would be a mistake to dismiss the entire thing as a hoax just because of the hair samples were fraudulent. And if you think of the Cottingley Fairy girls, briefly for those who don't know, in 1917 two girls, cousins aged 16 and 10, lived in Cottingley, just outside Bradford, claimed they saw fairies down at the stream nearby, and their father was sceptical, so they produced photos as proof. And for over 60 years they maintained these were genuine. It was only in 1981 that one of them admitted to having faked the photographs. And even then, the younger of the two said, well, we had to fake the photos because no one believed the fairies were real, so it was our way of proving. And I wonder if there's a parallel here with the photos of Jeff, that the family were utterly convinced that they had to kind of provide evidence, because they were under great pressure from not only Price and Fodor, but reporters from all over the world, psychical investigators, all sorts of authors. Fodor writes, often when supposed poltergeists are caught in the act of perpetrating a fraud, scientists are apt to say, I told you so, and ridicule the whole phenomenon. But it must be remembered that when you deal with poltergeists, you deal with unbalanced personalities. Once notoriety has been secured for the person around whom the disturbances occur, he is tempted to fake the manifestations after they have stopped in order to hold the centre of the stage. So, if Jeff wasn't a complete hoax, then what was he? And there are some suggestions in Jim's diaries about the supernatural. Initially, he started off saying this is perfectly normal, there's nothing supernatural, it's a talking animal. But as the years went on, he changed his mind.
Okay, so from April 34, he says, his speech is as clear and distinct as mine, and his vocabulary almost as extensive. So much so that we no longer look upon him as an animal, excepting in physical form only. The brain, intellect and knowledge is that of a human being, and a superhuman at that. And if he's not supernatural, he's certainly uncanny. My wife wishes me to add that, in her opinion, Jeff is something more than an animal, and that Jeff knows what that something actually is. But he will not say that my wife has continually tried to draw him out, and to speak of what he actually is. He'll only admit to being a clever animal, and on occasions he has said that he is a tree mongoose and a marsh mongoose. Twice I've heard him say, I'm an earthbound spirit.
And Jim also cited some instances of Jeff's apparent clairvoyant ability. So 5 to 10 minutes before I reach home, Jeff will suddenly call out to my wife, Jim's coming! How he knows it is another mystery, as the lay of the land prevents me being seen, coming up the hill from round the corner. Another time, Jim was outside shearing some of the sheep, and he was about 250 yards away, 300 yards from the house. The wife and the daughter were inside, and Jeff apparently is keeping up a running commentary, describing in some detail which sheep that Jim is clipping, and one of them's giving him some difficulty. So this is something like clairvoyance, if you believe it. Jim also thought Jeff had the power of invisibility, which would certainly explain his ability to spy on local people and down at the bus depot without being caught or being seen. The bus depot guys were so fed up with this that they set a trap on bus number 81. It was kind of an electrified trap, which Jim got to hear about. And he warned Jeff, he said, you've got to be careful. And Jeff said, don't worry, they'll never catch me. He's invisible, he's supernatural. Sometimes his physical body is in one place, and sometimes his voice is coming from 20 or 25 feet away. There's also something supernatural, I think, about this apparent ability to move around the house with astonishing speed. He commenced to thump and bang on the walls in different parts of the house with a wireless-like rapidity that one would have thought there were half a dozen Jeffs. But we've already heard about the idea of a poltergeist. I think the case has several classic elements, the knocking and banging, certainly, the objects being moved or thrown, teenage girl is a sort of stereotypical one. In the Enfield poltergeist case and the Bell Witch, they both had a very talkative and foul-mouthed entity. In Enfield, again, it initially started to make animal noises and gradually progressed to speech, which is exactly what happened with Jeff. Although as a poltergeist, Jeff is again doesn't quite fit the bill, because who ever heard of a poltergeist that ate and drank? Jeff told the Irvings that his existence was physical and he must have food to live. And who ever heard of a poltergeist that could catch a cold? Jim, I have a goddamn cough. I have a hell of a cold. You'll have to get me something. He wanted some kind of cough medicine, I think. So again, it doesn't quite fit the bill of any of these things. And in my opinion, there's no single explanation that covers all of this. There is some fraud, there's maybe some poltergeist stuff, there probably a collective mental delusion, a collective delusion, maybe a hysteria that took hold of the whole neighbourhood. But Jeff is a trickster figure, and he doesn't want to be pinned down, he doesn't want to be categorised. There was a South African spiritualist investigator lady visited the farm once, and she rather imperiously demanded that Jeff appeared and showed himself. "Come here, Jeff, I want you." Jeff's reply was, "No damn fear, you'll put me in a bottle." So he doesn't want to be put in a bottle, he doesn't want to be put in a box or categorised. And Mrs. Irving, Margaret, would often quiz him. She had a good relationship with Jeff, and she'd often say, "Tell us, what are you? What's your true nature?" And he said, "Of course I know what I am, and you're not going to get to know. And you're only grigged is a Manx word meaning vexed or disappointed. You're only grigged because I won't tell you. I might let you see me sometime, but thou wilt never get to know what I am." And in response to Margaret's expression of disbelief, when he used to say he was an animal, "Animal? You're no animal." And Jeff answered enigmatically with what Jim described as a most emphatic voice, "I know I am not." Just one last picture of volume. I like this. She's looking rather enigmatic, far away look in her eyes. In 1970, so this is nearly 40 years after the case, a journalist for Fate magazine managed to track her down. Now she'd left the island, remained incognito. She didn't like talking about this. She refused any interviews. Somehow this guy, Walter McGraw, was very persistent and somehow persuaded her to talk. And she still maintained that Jeff had not been a hoax, but she didn't really have happy memories of it. "I was shy," she said. "I still am. He made me meet people," he's Jeff, "he made me meet people I didn't want to meet. Then they said I was mental or a ventriloquist. Believe me, if I was that good, I would jolly well be making money. Jeff was very detrimental to my life. We were snubbed. The other children used to call me the spook." So there's a kind of blurring. Jeff, we think of him as the talking mongoose, but on the Isle of Man he was the Doarlish the spook, but they called Rory the spook. "I had to leave the Isle of Man, and I hope that no one where I work now ever knows the story. Jeff has even kept me from getting married. How could I ever tell a man's family about what happened?" And in response to this journalist's query as to whether Jeff had been a mongoose, she said, "I don't know. I know he was a small animal about 9 inches to a foot long. I know he talked to us from behind the woodwork wainscoting. His voice was very high-pitched. He swore a lot. At first he talked to me more than anyone. We carried on regular conversations, and he put her on the spot. asked her outright, was it a hoax? And she said, it was not a hoax, but I wish it had never happened. If my father and I had if my mother and I had our way, we never would have told anybody about it. But Father was sort of wrapped up in it. It was such a wonderful phenomenon that he just had to tell people about it. And I think it's odd, to say the least, that she still insisted 40 years later that this had been true, if it had blighted her life to such an extent. She could have cleared the whole thing up just by saying it was a hoax that got out of hand, but she never did. She maintained it was true. Yes, there was a little animal who talked and did all those other things. He said he was a mongoose and said we should call him Jeff. But I do wish he had let me alone. Thank you.